Last time in our study of Acts, we noted how God guided Paul, Silas, and Timothy from Galatia to Macedonia, where they first visited the Roman colony of Philippi. While there, Paul cast out a demon from a slave girl, after which he experienced his first persecution initiated by Gentiles. He and Silas were beaten and placed in prison for the night. The following day, they used their Roman citizenship, which resulted in apologies and public acknowledgement by the local magistrates, the local authorities, that Paul and Silas had been wrongly punished and incarcerated. After the magistrates begged them to leave, Paul and Silas and Timothy left Philippi and headed for Thessalonica. After spending several weeks at the synagogue in Thessalonica, the Jews who rejected the gospel stirred up some of the Gentiles and attempted to have Paul and Silas arrested for sedition against Rome. However, after the local brethren promised to send the traveling companions and Paul out of the city and posted bond, they and Timothy left for Berea that very night. We also found that the Jews in Berea were much more open-minded than the ones in Thessalonica, and which led to many of the Jews there, as well as Gentiles, becoming believers. Yet, once again, the unbelieving Jews from other towns showed up in Berea, intent on shutting Paul up for good. Paul was able, as we saw in the closing part of our study last time, he was able to escape with the aid of some of the Berean brethren who accompanied him all the way to the city of Athens to the south. So that brings us to chapter 17, verse 16, where we're ready to pick up today, and I'll read here from Goodspeed's translation. While Paul waited for them at Athens, that is, Silas and Timothy, he was exasperated or deeply distressed to see how idolatrous the city was. At the time that Paul arrived there, Athens was a small town virtually. The population was only somewhere around 10,000 people. The city's greatness was long gone. It had gone several hundred years earlier. The only reason Paul had come to Athens was to escape the hate-filled Jews from Thessalonica. He was anxious, as verse 16 shows us, for Silas and Timothy to arrive so that they could move on and go continue their trip to the west. Yet while waiting in the city, filled with pagan temples and statuary, Paul felt he needed to do something beneficial, something that might be able to help these Gentiles. Verse 17, therefore, he reasoned, or he began holding discussions, the complete Jewish Bible has. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, or God-fearers, as the complete Jewish Bible brings out, and in the marketplace, or the city square, daily with those who happened to be there. So we find that Paul spent the Sabbaths in the synagogue and weekdays in the area of the city where the greatest amount of population would be, which of course was the marketplace, where people would come to the market. Many people would go there every day or every other day because, again, there was no refrigeration back then. And so there was a lot of traffic, a lot of pedestrians coming through, and so Paul was able to speak with those individuals. Verse 18 goes on, then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered, or Goodspeed has, debated with him. Now, we've heard of Epicureans and Stoics before. The Epicureans took their name from their founder, the Greek named Epicurus, who philosophized that attaining pleasure was the primary goal for this temporary material existence. They denied the existence of God and scoffed at the idea that the creation had been planned by a supreme being. believing that the universe came into existence by chance when excessive numbers of atoms, which float around in the universe all the time, and the way their philosophy was, all of a sudden converged together and the universe came into existence. That was the Epicurean idea of creation. They ridiculed the belief in literal pagan gods and goddesses, limiting them to being nothing more than phantoms imagined by human beings. They believed that the soul of man, the life essence of man, dissolved and disappeared at the time of death. Disappeared forever, never to ever come again. The Stoics were founded by a Greek by the name of Zeno. And they took their name Stoics from the Greek word for porch or colonnade. The word is stoa. And it was at the Greek, a porch or a colonnade in the marketplace where Zeno usually taught when he was in Athens. And so they named themselves after the place where their original philosopher had philosophized. They believed that there was a power or spirit of reason that did have existence in the universe, but that reason, that power, did not really create the universe. Rather, that power or spirit only organized what emanated within the universe. They condemned their fellow Greeks for using temples and worshiping images and idols of many gods, believing that it was much more important, rather than wasting your time doing such a frivolous act, to following the laws of nature and practice self-denial by resisting the senses that stimulate pleasure, pain, joy, and grief. That was the main objective in life. They also believed that at death, the soul of man, the essence, the life essence of man, would either be burned or would somehow dissolve or be absorbed into the spirit of reason that was in the universe. Both of these philosophies represented attempts to resolve the questions of what and why is man, apart from the revelation that God has provided within the pages of the Holy Scriptures. That was the best that they could come up with, apart from divine revelation. Going on in verse 18, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign or strange gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection." Now, a babbler, this word babbler, coming from a particular Greek word, was one who took ideas that were formulated by others, claimed that he, the babbler, originated these, came up with these ideas on his own, and then continued to proliferate or repeat these ideas to others without having any comprehension or understanding of what he was saying. That's a babbler. That was what they were saying and accusing Paul of. Well, he's picked up some of these ideas from strange philosophers, and he's put them all together, and he's saying this. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Verse 19, and they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, or Goodspeed better has, the Council of the Areopagus. Now, the Areopagus was the Senate or city council of a Greek city-state. So Athens was not the only town with an Areopagus. This was a council, so the name for the city council. It met on Mars Hill, but that was a council, and their meeting place was there. So they took him, brought him to the Council of Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. Therefore, we want to know what these things mean." The followers of the two main philosophies in Athens thought that Paul was kind of a little flaky, and so they brought him to the city council. Ostensibly, at least on the surface, they're saying, "We want to learn from you. We want to find out what you know." And they were probably more likely looking for an opportunity to mock him, to make fun of him before the council. Verse 21, Luke gives us a little aside here, a parenthetical aside. He says, "For all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing," or as the Complete Jewish Bible has, to either tell or hear the latest intellectual fads. Luke's parenthetical insertion at this point reflected the evaluations that contemporaries of his had made concerning the frivolous obsessions of what were considered to be the most learned, the most educated of all of the Athenians. These were the smartest people. At least they certainly thought they were. And so, but it wasn't just Luke. This was kind of a common thing. People were saying, these guys they just waste their time talking about things that are of no value. They're not productive. Verse 22, "Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus," or the Revised English Bible says, he stood before the council of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things, or in all respects," the New American Standard has, "you are very religious." Paul knew his audience. He always did. Therefore, he did not refer them to the Holy Scriptures or Israel's history like he did his Jewish audience back in Pisidian Antioch that we covered in chapter 13. Nor did he use here the same approach that he did in Lystra about the blessings of rain and food and joy, all originating from God who created the earth, when he was addressing the pagan idolaters there in Lystra back in chapter 14. As in both of those cases, and now that he's before the Athenian council, Paul related to his audience on common ground. He found something that he could use, that he could begin to weave and tell them about the gospel. He used the approach he later mentioned in the letter that he sent to the church in Corinth, of being all things to all men. That's back in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, about verse 20, where he makes that statement. Paul addressed all of the people of Athens. Notice again, men of Athens. That's everyone, rather than simply addressing the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. He was addressing everyone there, because those philosophers only made up a very small percentage of the population of Athens. Verse 23, I perceive in all respects you are very religious, for as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing him, or worship in ignorance, Goodspeed translates, him I proclaim to you. The common ground that Paul used to begin addressing the people, as well as the group of self-absorbed intellectuals among the Epicureans and Stoics, centered on an altar that he mentions here to a God of which they were totally ignorant. They put that altar there because, well, we may have overlooked somebody, and so, we're going to have an altar there just in case. And that's why they did it. And so they, again, had this altar to an unknown God. And they worshiped it just like they did the altars of their other gods. Paul offered to explain to them the God that they didn't know, that they attempted to worship. Verse 24, New King James has, God who made the world, or, as the Complete Jewish Bible has, the universe, which is probably better, God who made the universe and everything in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, He's the master of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. The majority of the Greeks believed that each of their many gods and goddesses created different things out of pre-existing materials. We have the whole pantheon of the Greek gods and goddesses. Poseidon was responsible for the oceans and ruling over the sea life and all of it. And so, again, they had different ones for different things. Vulcan, or was that the Roman god? Anyway, we have all of the different gods and goddesses, but what they made was already there. That's the way they understood it. Yet neither the Epicureans nor the Stoics believed a supreme being brought the entire universe into being. These erroneous conclusions resulted from their ignorance of the true God, who Paul was connecting to their altar to the unknown God. Unlike all of the marble temples spread throughout Athens for the Greek gods and goddesses, the unknown God dwells completely outside of the material world. He does not need a temple. He does not need any physical edifice. Verse 25, New Living Translation has, "And human hands can't serve His needs, for He has no needs. He Himself gives life and breath to everything, and He satisfies every need." The Revised English Bible has for verse 25, "It is not because He lacks anything that He accepts service at our hands, for He is Himself the universal giver of life and breath, indeed of everything." Unlike the Greek gods, which required human hands to create images of them and construct temples for them, the unknown God, Paul says, has all power, and He needs nothing done for Him. He brought it all into being. He is self-sufficient. He has no other needs, unlike these statues, unlike these temples that you have constructed. Your gods did not construct the temples for themselves. You had to do it for them. In fact, you had to do everything for them because they're non-existent. Verse 26, New Living Translation continues, "From one man," or one forefather, Goodspeed has. One blood has the King James and New King James. "From one man," or one forefather, or blood, He, this God, created all the nations throughout the whole earth. Now, Paul made this point because the Athenians claimed that their origin was from the soil of their land, and that soil was the best soil on earth, and that they were therefore superior to all other men and all other nations. But Paul revealed that the unknown God that they thought that they were worshiping began all of humanity through one man. All go back to the one. He, verse 26 goes on in the New Living, He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall. Or as the New Revised Standard has, the times of their existence. The times when the nations would come, the times when the nations would go. Before creating the universe, back here in Isaiah chapter 46, before creating the universe, God predetermined exactly how His plan would unfold. Verse 9, Isaiah 46, verse 9. I'll read from the Revised English Bible translation. "Remember all that happened long ago." God is speaking here. "For I am God, and there is none other. I am God, and there is no one like me. From the beginning I reveal the end." Note, from the very beginning I reveal the end. I tell you what the outcome is going to be at the very start. "From ancient times what is yet to be, I say, my purpose stands. I shall accomplish all that I please. So God predetermined everything, exactly how it would unfold. Now, in order for events to unfold as He has determined, back here in Daniel chapter 2, God has had and will always have total control of the rulers of the nations. God has to be in charge and in control. Here, breaking into Daniel 2, verse 21, Daniel makes the statement, He, God, removes kings and raises up kings. God makes the determination. Over here in chapter 4 of Daniel, verse 17, breaking into verse 17, the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, or the kingdoms of men, gives it to whomever He will, and sets over it the lowest or the basest of men. God has complete control, complete mastery over all. Getting back to chapter 17 of Acts and verse 26, He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, the time when they would have their existence. And Paul could be referring here to the fact that here Athens, if we go back 200-300 years ago, in the time of Alexander the Great, Athens was a marvelous city. Huge population, probably 500,000 people. It was a phenomenal city. But look at it now. What Athens was is gone. And so, you thinking you're so great and somehow you're better than others. God allowed Athens to be the great city, and God is also responsible for it being what it is now. He goes on in chapter 17, verse 26, New Living Translation, and He determined their boundaries long before Abraham was born. God had already determined the exact location of land that would become the property of the descendants of His grandson Jacob, and where all of the other nations would reside in relation to the land given to the sons of Jacob. Back here in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. We read, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations. God is the one who determined their boundaries. He determined their inheritance, that is, where they would exist, where they would be. When He divided their inheritance to the nations, He separated the sons of Adam. He set the boundaries of the peoples, note, according to the number of the children of Israel. Based upon what God knew the population of the tribes of Israel would become, He set the boundaries of the nations that surrounded them. God made that determination long before He ever even tapped Abraham on the shoulder. So He determined their boundaries, chapter 17, verse 26. Going on in verse 27, New International has, God did this so that men would seek Him, or seek the Lord, the New King James has, and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. God, according to what Paul told the Athenians here, God spread mankind over the face of the entire earth to witness the variety of God's creation. By observing the complexity of the creation in the unique area that each nation was appointed, in its geology, in its flora, its fauna, in the view of the heavens from whatever location on the face of the earth, by the observation of all of these things, all men would have the opportunity to comprehend the reality of the existence of the supreme God of heaven and earth. David, back in Psalm 19, talks about the heavens and looking into the heavens and the fact that the heavens reveal very clearly the existence of a great Creator. Psalm 19, verse 1. I'll read here from the New Living Translation. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display His craftsmanship. Day after day they continue to speak. Night after night they make Him known. They speak without a sound or word. Their voice is never heard. Yet their message is gone throughout the earth, and their words to all the world. God has made a home in the heavens for the sun. It bursts forth like a radiant bridegroom after his wedding. It rejoices like a great athlete, eager to run the race. The sun rises at one end of the heavens, follows its course to the other end. Nothing can hide from its heat. And so David explained the fact that by observation alone, men should come to the recognition of the Almighty Supreme Creator God. Back in chapter 17, verse 28, for in Him we live and move and have our being, or we exist, as Goodspeed has. In order to show how close God is to every man, Paul makes this statement to stress God's omnipresence, which is something that David did as well back in Psalm 139. Let's go back, read this very quickly. Psalm 139, verse 7. From the New International, David asks, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. David understood God is present. God knows everything going on in every square inch of the universe. There's nothing that escapes His attention or His knowledge. And so Paul back here again says, for in Him we live and move and have our being. Now, Paul deliberately phrased this description of the omnipresence of God in order to parallel what was written by the Greek poet Epimenides. Because Epimenides used this very phrase in the Greek. If you go to the Greek of this and you compare it, it's the same phrase. And he used it in relating honor given to Zeus by his son Minos. So there was a poet that Epimenides wrote, and he used that very phrase. So Paul pulled that out, and he uses it because he knows this is going to get the attention. He's using somebody that they knew real well. You know, Epimenides to the Greeks of Athens at that time was like maybe Mark Twain to us. You know, somebody that we are familiar with. We know, we could recognize what he had written. Going on in verse 28, as also some of your own poets have said, for we, quote, for we are also His offspring, or we are also His children, the Complete Jewish Bible has. To continue emphasizing the closeness of God to man, Paul now uses or refers to a statement by the Greek poet Aratus. And this statement is concerning the relationship of the Greeks to Zeus. This is what Aratus said about the Greeks and their relationship to Zeus. They are the children of Zeus. They are the offspring of Zeus. That's what he said. By using these quotes of well-known poets, which were quickly recognized by his audience, Paul inferred that even their own poets, men who had preceded them, they'd both been dead for a couple of hundred years by this time, but again, their own poets could comprehend some of the qualities of the true God, even though they erroneously credited those qualities to the primary god of the Greeks, being Zeus. Verse 29, Complete Jewish Bible translates, so, since we are children of God, we shouldn't suppose that God's essence or the divine nature, as the New King James has, that the divine nature resembles, or the Revised English Bible has, is like an image in gold, silver, or stone, shaped by human technique and imagination. Or gold, silver, and stone, Revised English Bible has, shaped by craftsmanship and design, by human craftsmanship and design. The New Living Translation translates verse 29, and since this is true, that we are children of God, we shouldn't think of God as an idol designed by craftsmen from gold or silver or stone. Now, from the spot where Paul was standing as he's addressing the council, the city council, numerous statues of Greek gods and goddesses made of marble and of bronze could be seen here and there around the city because they're up on the hill. And you can look out over and you can see all of this stuff. You can see temples and you can see statues. And so all of the stuff that they could see. It was within that setting that he subtly condemned their idolatry. Since man is the offspring of God, man is like him from the point of view that both are living, intelligent beings of far greater worth than inanimate metals and minerals. It is therefore, Paul is telling them, it's an insult to represent and worship the Creator by fashioning images from any physical material. And so he condemned their idolatry. Going on in verse 30, the New International has, in the past, God overlooked such ignorance. He overlooked it. But now, he commands all people everywhere to repent. People have misunderstood this verse, unfortunately. What Paul is referring to is from the moment sin entered into this cosmos, this world, or created this cosmos, God has allowed mankind to pursue the course of the tree represented, the course represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Throughout that whole time, God has shown favor that has opened their understanding to the truth to only a very few individuals here and there. Opened up Noah's mind, one of his sons' minds, Abraham. You know, we can find a few people here and there. Well, we can go all the way back to Abel and Enoch, because they also, he opened there. But just a few, one in a century, or one in, who knows, one in 500 years maybe before the flood. Only a very few individuals has he allowed to see and understand. He selected them and he gave them his Spirit. He worked, yes, with the descendants of Jacob for centuries. For centuries, he revealed to them his law. And his law defines him, defines his thinking, his mind. And so he revealed to them the law, but only a few in all of that time did he impart his Spirit to. He did not give his Spirit wholesale to the descendants of Jacob. However, not until the coming of the Messiah and the death, resurrection, and ascension of the Messiah did God command that his law be disseminated to all the other nations. It had always been to the descendants of Jacob. Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and then to Jacob's descendants. That's it. It wasn't given to the rest of the nations. They were in ignorance. But now God commands all people everywhere to repent. With the knowledge of the law comes the need to recognize that God is the author of the law, and therefore it should be obeyed. And if it's not obeyed, we need to repent of disobeying it. This is what he's telling the Athenians. Now, going on, he now commands all people everywhere to repent because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained or designated. The day to which Paul refers, on which the Messiah will judge the world in righteousness, occurs after Jesus Christ returns, as we're told in Isaiah chapter 11. First 6, 7 verses, we read there about Jesus Christ judging in righteousness. As is evident in his first letter to the congregation, the brethren in Thessalonica, which he had not yet at this time written. It wouldn't be long after this particular point in the story that Paul writes to the Thessalonians, but up to this point he has not written. And in that first letter, it's clear, especially from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, that Paul believed Jesus was going to return very soon. He thought the fulfillment of Isaiah 11 verses 1 through 7, actually all of chapter 11, was going to be happening shortly, within his lifetime. It was therefore evident that all people would soon find the true God and see the need to repent. Verse 31 goes on. He has given assurance or proof, the complete Jewish Bible has. He's given proof of this to all by raising him from the dead. That is the man that he has designated, appointed, the Messiah. He has given proof because he raised him from the dead. Jesus declared, back here in John chapter 5, John 5, Jesus declared here that the Father had given him authority to both resurrect the dead and to judge, to be the judge of all men. Verse 21, John 5, for as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son. Now, skipping over to verse 25, most assuredly, I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. He is going to be the judge because he has experienced life in the flesh. He's experienced what it is to be a man and the pulls that a man must fight. He has gone through that, so he's the perfect judge. Now, the only way that Jesus could utilize the authority given him by the Father, as he says here, and fulfill these functions was to be resurrected to immortality after dying to pay the penalty for the sins of all mankind. The Father raised him from the dead and had him appear over the span of 40 days to hundreds of witnesses who verified his resurrection. And so that's why Paul says here, he has given assurance, he's given proof of this to all by raising him from the dead. There are plenty of witnesses around. In fact, it would be years later when Paul makes the point in 1 Corinthians 15 that there were over 500 who saw him alive after his resurrection. Over 500. And he hasn't even written that letter yet. And he said most of them were still alive at that time when he wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians. Going on here in verse 32. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked or began to scoff, while others said, we will hear you again on this matter. Both the Epicureans and the Stoics believed that this mortal life is all there is. There is nothing more. That the soul dissolves, disappears, is destroyed at death. Neither one of them could accept the idea of a resurrection. Rather than listening to anything more that Paul had to say, they dismissed him by telling him that, you know what, you can come back at a later time and we can pick this up. But they were tired of it, and so they dismissed him. Verse 33, so Paul departed from them, seeing that trying to convince them was a waste of time. These professed intellectuals who knew so much better than what God revealed in His Word, according to the way Paul was thinking, he saw that it was a fruitless endeavor to continue on. So he made no attempt to reason with them any further. He just walked off. Now, we find in verse 34, Goodspeed translates, some persons joined him, however, and became believers. Among them, Dionysius, a member of the council. Notice, one of the members of the council of the Areopagus actually became a believer. And a woman named Damaris, and some others. We're not told how many, but we have here at least 4 that heard what he had to say, and they were moved and became believers. Now, these individuals were certainly not followers of either the Epicureans or the Stoics, but these were individuals part of the Men of Athens group that he addressed. Now, according to Paul's first letter to the church in Thessalonica, let's turn over here to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. According to what we read here, Silas and Timothy must have finally arrived from Berea about this time, because Paul, once they arrived, immediately sent Timothy from Athens back to Thessalonica and sent Silas, apparently, back to Philippi. Because here we read in 1 Thessalonians 3, verse 1, therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone, and send Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith. He's telling the Thessalonians this. Now, to be left alone in Athens, he was alone, waiting for Timothy and Silas. And once they get there, he decides, I'm going to send you back, because apparently he was so concerned after having to leave Philippi, after having to leave Thessalonica because of the problems with the unbelieving Jews. And so, therefore, look, I need you guys to go back and check on this. I'm worried sick. I want you to go back and check on the groups. And so they may have only been in Athens a day and then had to turn around and go back north again. And then Paul was alone in Athens a second time. Now, we come to chapter 18, verse 1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. See, Luke doesn't mention about the fact that they did return before Paul left there. He doesn't mention it. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. Now, Corinth, like Philippi, was a Roman colony, and it became the capital of the Roman province of Achaia in 27 BC. Its population was probably in excess of 200,000 people, much larger than the city of Athens. Due to its strategic location at the intersection of both land and sea trade routes, Corinth prospered greatly from all of the commerce that flowed through the city. However, in addition to growing wealth, Corinth also experienced the problem of increasing immorality. It was considered to be the most corrupt, the most licentious, perverted city in all of the Roman Empire, worse than Rome itself. That was the designation of Corinth. Now, according to one of the letters that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth about 5 years after this particular point in time in the story, Paul revealed that when he first came to Corinth, he arrived in the city in a weakened state, that he was nervous and that he was trembling or shaking all over. That's the way he introduces us in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. He's telling the Corinthians this. When I first came among you, this is how I came. Part of his condition may have been due to the rejections that he had experienced in Macedonia as well as at Athens. And the most likely reason for this condition as he came there was his worry over the brethren in Macedonia, both in Philippi and Thessalonica. Another part of his problem of being worried and shaking all over could have been the result of a physical ailment. He may have experienced permanent damage to his body from being stoned and left for dead, as well as being beaten with many rods, if you'll remember, when he was up in Thessalonica or in Philippi. In fact, it may have been around this time when God was petitioned by Paul for the second or maybe the third time to be healed of his thorn in the flesh that he mentions when he wrote the letter that we call 2 Corinthians, back in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He said that he pleaded with God 3 times to take away the thorn in the flesh. And it may have been during this point. He was in a very down time, in a kind of a depressed, anxious state of anxiety when he first came to Corinth. Verse 2, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, or a native of Pontus. Pontus was an area located along the southern shore of the Black Sea. So Aquila was originally from that area, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. And then he tells us why. Because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he, Paul, came to them, Aquila and Priscilla. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, the Emperor Claudius took this action in the year AD 49. He did that, he expelled all of the Jews in order to end the continual disturbances that were instigated by a man that Suetonius called Chrestus. Chrestus. Now, some people believe that Suetonius was actually referring to disputes in Rome between unbelieving Jews and Jews who had accepted Christos. Christos, Chrestos, very similar when you look at the names in the Greek, and it may have been the case. Now, Chrestos could have been somebody altogether different, just a troublemaker, and it could be that they were looking at the supporters, the ones who followed Chrestos or Christos, and the ones who didn't. And so that there were some uproars taking place. Again, who knows? We have nothing more than speculation on that. Verse 3. So, because he was of the same trade, that is, Paul of the same trade as Aquila and Priscilla, he stayed with them and worked. For by occupation they were tent makers. At this point in his ministry, Paul was receiving no regular support from any congregation. So he began using the training that he had as a tent maker, or possibly a leather worker. Some say that the word can mean either, a tent maker or a leather worker. He did this for financial support. Aquila and Priscilla had obviously built a very successful business in Rome, but were forced to leave. And so when they left Rome, they may have left some Romans working that particular business there, but they established another branch, if you will, in Corinth when they were forced to leave. It is never revealed whether this husband and wife were already converted when Paul met them, which if there were arguments between believing and unbelieving Jews that caused the expulsion, could very well be that they had already been believers. We don't know. But either they were, or their conversion occurred after spending time with Paul. That much we'll have to wait till the resurrection to find out. Verse 4, and he reasoned or held discussions in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. As was his normal custom, Paul began his ministry at the Jewish synagogue, where both Jews and God-fearing Gentiles met on the Sabbath. It's always what he did. Verse 5, New American Standard. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, after accomplishing the missions that Paul had assigned them while in Athens, Silas and Timothy returned to Paul in Corinth. Back here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, we find here in his opening address to the brethren in Thessalonica, he tells the Thessalonians that at the time he wrote this letter to the church, they, Timothy and Silas, were with him. Verse 1, 1 Thessalonians 1, Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy, to the church of the Thessalonians in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. All right, so now they joined him again. They came down to Athens, but then they were sent back by Paul back up to Macedonia, specifically to Thessalonica and Philippi, because they'd come down from Berea, remember. In chapter 3, let's also note here in chapter 3 of 1 Thessalonians verse 6, New International has, but Timothy has just now come to us from you and has brought good news about your faith and love. He has told us that you always have pleasant memories of us and that you long to see us, just as we also long to see you. And so it's very clear, again, the timing of when 1 Thessalonians was written. Right about this time and shortly thereafter, Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians. This is the time frame in the unveiling of the chronology in the book of Acts. Going on here in chapter 18, verse 5, New American Standard picks up again. Paul, after Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the Word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now, in order for Paul to quit his tent-making job, he had to have some means of support. There was, I guess there were a couple of possibilities. First, Silas and Timothy, after arriving from Macedonia, could have both brought financial support from Macedonia. We know from what Paul writes in Philippians chapter 4 that the church in Philippi, the brethren in Philippi, sent him aid on a number of occasions. So they may have brought some down. In fact, maybe some of the Thessalonians also had brought, had given some financial support to Silas, to Timothy to bring down. Whatever the case, that's likely what happened. He received some financial support from Macedonia. It's also possible that Silas and Timothy both took jobs. And again, we know Silas was a scribe, and scribes could easily find work because it was a highly technical field. And so Silas could have hired himself out as a scribe part-time. Timothy could also have done something. Again, we don't know. Paul made it clear, however, that he never, at any point in time, took financial support from the Corinthians. He did state that he did receive support from brethren in Macedonia during the time that he was in Corinth. Back in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses about 6 or 7 in that section, he says, I never, ever, and I never took anything from you, because they were making accusations against him. He said, I never took anything. I received financial support from Macedonia, but not from any of you. Going on here in verse 6, New International. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes, or the folds of his cloak, in protest. This action was like shaking the dust from sandals. Remember Jesus back in Matthew chapter 10, if they won't accept you, kick the dust off your sandals and keep on going. Back in Acts chapter 13, we see pretty much the same thing, where Paul and Barnabas left. But again, shaking the dust from sandals or from your clothes visually symbolized that you were being completely severed from all contact with God's representative. And if you're going to be severed from God's representative, you're going to be separated and severed from God. And so that's what Paul was doing with these Jews who were not accepting him. Going on in verse 6, the New International continues, and said to them, Paul said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am clear of my responsibility. Or, the Revised English Bible, my conscience is clear. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Paul had fulfilled his responsibility of going first to the Jews, who were, as again, remember back in chapter 3, the Apostle Peter brought out very clearly, the Jews were the descendants of the prophets, and they were the heirs of the promises made to Abraham. And so Peter understood that he needed to go first to the Jews. Paul understood the same thing, and he's been doing that. He understood his accountability was like that of Ezekiel, if you'll remember, back in Ezekiel chapter 33. Ezekiel 33, verse 7. I'll read from the New International. God told Ezekiel, Son of man, I've made you a watchman for the house of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked, O wicked man, you will surely die, and you do not speak out to dissuade him from his ways, that wicked man will die for his sin, and I will hold you accountable for his blood. But if you do warn the wicked man to turn from his ways, and he does not do so, he will die for his sin, but you will have saved yourself. So Paul understood. He had an accountability. He was to first go to the Jew, then to the Gentile. He had delivered the message to the primary recipients, the Jews, but it had been rejected by some of them. In fact, apparently most of them. He was now free to take the message to others, and so he would take it to the Gentiles. Back in chapter 18 again, verse 7. And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus. Some of the translations have Justus or Titius Justus. Titius Justus. One who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. So Paul left the synagogue, walked next door to the house of Justus. He established the house of Justus as his base of operations. Justus was a believing Gentile. Based on a statement that Paul made in his letter to the brethren in Rome that was written from Corinth, Justus may have also had the name Gaius. You look at some of the Roman names, they had 4, 5, 6 names. Claudius, this guy, whatever. And so it was. It could very well be that Justus also had the name Titius and Gaius. Because in Romans chapter 16, verse 23, Paul wrote that Gaius, my host and the host of the church, the whole church here in Corinth. And so Gaius hosted the church at his home. And here we find that Paul established his operation at the house next door to the synagogue. Verse 8. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Paul later wrote that he personally had baptized both Crispus and Gaius. That's in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Going on in verse 9, now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. Based on his past experiences in Galatia and in Macedonia, Paul may have been very worried that the same level of hostility, the hostile opposition that he had in both of those areas might yet arise in Corinth if he continued to preach the word with the same fervency that he had up to this point since he had come to town. So, in order to allay that worry, that anxiety, Jesus gave him this vision to provide him added strength to press forward. He also encouraged Paul by informing him that the Father had already selected a large number of people in Corinth to call through the gospel message that Paul would yet bring to them. So the Father had informed Jesus that I've selected this many. And, when they hear the message, then they're going to be drawn. Verse 11. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. God provided Paul with the protection promised. So Paul was able to carry on his ministry at Corinth from the fall of AD 50 into the spring of AD 52. 1 year and 6 months. Verse 12. Now, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, Gallio was the proconsul, that is the one that the Roman Senate appointed to govern the Roman colony. Okay, Gallio was the proconsul between AD 51 and 53. AD 51 and 53. So this fits exactly within the chronology that Luke lays out for us here. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews, with one accord, rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." Now, Paul had been ministering in Corinth for 8 to 9 months before Gallio took office. Shortly after Gallio assumed his position, the unbelieving Jews sought to manipulate this new proconsul by charging Paul with preaching an illegitimate religion, thereby breaking Roman law. Again, we've covered before what Roman law required. Only the Jews were allowed to not worship the Roman gods along with their worship of the true God. Everybody else in the Roman Empire, all the other religions, you can hold your religion, but you still have to show honor to the Roman gods. But the Jews were excluded from that. And so, all right, they're accusing Paul. He's preaching a different religion. He doesn't have the right to do that. Verse 14, New International. Just as Paul was about to speak, he's about to defend himself, Gallio said to the Jews, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or inflicted injury, as Complete Jewish Bible has, or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you." We find here that God continued to protect Paul by helping the proconsul to quickly see through this deceitful ploy of the unbelieving Jews. It would be reasonable for me to listen to you, but, going on in the New International, verse 15, since it involves questions about words and names, or words and titles, and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. So he had them ejected from the court. Gallio quickly saw that no crime against Rome or a Roman citizen had been committed. The only conflict that he detected involved disagreement over Jewish teachings. That's the way he viewed it. His refusal to judge the case was equivalent to the Roman recognition of Christianity as equal with Judaism, making Christianity an officially sanctioned religion throughout the Roman Empire. This was a major thing. Now, no one could object to what the gospel that was being preached was all about. The Jews had no legal jurisdiction to make that charge against those proclaiming the gospel any longer. Verse 17, then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice, or he paid no attention to any of these things, the New Revised Standard has. Sosthenes was either one of several rulers of the synagogue in Corinth, or he became the ruler of the synagogue after Crispus became a believer. Remember, Crispus was mentioned as being ruler of the synagogue. Now, if this Sosthenes is the same person who is mentioned as being one who served as Paul's scribe when he later wrote the church in Corinth from Ephesus, you'll find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1. There's a Sosthenes that was a scribe for Paul there in Ephesus. If it's the same one, then at some point in time after his beating, Sosthenes also became a believer. So both of the rulers of the synagogue in Corinth became believers. Verse 18, so Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. Now the incident with Gallio probably occurred in July of AD 51, because that was the first day of July was when the proconsul would take office. That was the normal time. And so if he took office on day one, by the 4th of July, there were probably fireworks with these unbelieving Jews. They had brought Paul forward as soon as possible before Gallio could get situated in his new position. That would mean Paul remained in Corinth at least 9 more months until the spring of AD 52. Going on in verse 18, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow, or Revised English Bible, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea in fulfillment of a vow, or the New Living Translation, marking the end of a vow. Now, the only vow that involved the cutting of hair was the Nazirite vow. Numbers chapter 6 goes through most of the chapter about the Nazirite vow and about the hair, the cutting of the hair, where it was to be done, etc., etc. For some reason, Paul had apparently felt the need to take a Nazirite vow in order to strengthen his bond with God. Since the Nazirite vow required that the head be shaved at the tabernacle in Numbers 6, later on it would be at the temple, in one of the courts of the temple. You had to, that was where the vow ended. You came to the temple, had your hair shaved, and then there were purification rituals that you had to undergo. Since it was required that it be done there, God must have made some allowances for Jews who lived outside the land of Israel to cut their hair and bring it to the temple whenever they returned to the land. Because if they took the vow, for 6 months, and there was no way they could afford to get to Jerusalem, they'd have to come at a pilgrimage festival or whatever, then it would be hard for them to keep the vow. And so there may have been some kind of allowances. That we don't know. Verse 19, and he came to Ephesus and left them there. That is, he left Aquila and Priscilla at Ephesus. Aquila and Priscilla came apparently to either open a new branch of their business in the capital of the Roman province of Asia, or they were completely relocating their operation from Corinth to Ephesus. But I have an idea they probably had a thriving business in Corinth, as large as the city was, and then came to Ephesus in order to open up another branch. Either way, they remained in Ephesus and hosted the local congregation in Ephesus in their home for the next 4 to 5 years, at which time, according to Romans chapter 16, they returned to Rome. They went back to Rome because the edict of expelling the Jews had come to an end, and so they went back to their original home. Again, he came to Ephesus, left them there, but he himself, Paul himself, entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. This was one of those rare occasions, like in Berea, where Jews were receptive to what Paul taught. Despite their interest, however, Paul was determined to be in Jerusalem by Pentecost. That would be the time. He would want it to be there by Pentecost. The coming feast would be the Feast of Pentecost. So he promised to return to them if it was God's will for him to do so. Verse 22, and when he landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. Now, Luke sums up a huge amount of time here in this very quick verse. After reaching the harbor at Caesarea, Paul traveled 65 miles south-southeast to get to Jerusalem, where he met with the brethren, possibly spent an entire month there if the purification associated with the Nazirite vow was extant at that time, that it took 30 days. He may have had to spend a whole month there, after which he presented his cut hair that was cut at Centuria, and then he headed north from Jerusalem 300 miles to Antioch in Syria. Verse 23, after he had spent some time there, now he probably remained in Antioch from midsummer of AD 52 until the spring of AD 53. That would have been the most logical time. After he had spent some time there, he departed and went over all the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order. Or, Goodspeed has, he went over all the region of Galatia and Phrygia systematically. That is, he had it all mapped out exactly where he was going, strengthening all the disciples. It was then, after spending this maybe 9 months in Antioch, that Paul began what would be his third missionary journey, which involved, first of all, revisiting all of the churches in the southern part of the region of Galatia, and then moving on into the area of Phrygia, which was the region that lay between the province of Galatia in the east and Asia in the west. And so that's where we conclude then at this point. And we'll pick it up then next time in the next verse.